There's a moment in every criminal investigation where everything hangs in the balance. A single decision, a missed clue, a rushed judgment. In that moment, the scales of justice can tip in the wrong direction, and when they do, the consequences echo through decades. Innocent lives are destroyed. Guilty people walk free. Families are torn apart. And the truth, that elusive thing we all claim to seek, gets buried under layers of mistakes, misconduct, and sometimes, deliberate deception. Today, we're diving into the dark side of criminal investigations, where the system designed to protect us became the very thing that failed us. These are the cases where everything went wrong. Imagine waking up one morning as a free person, going about your daily routine, maybe grabbing coffee, maybe heading to work, and then suddenly, your entire world collapses. The police arrive. You're arrested. You're accused of a crime you didn't commit. And no matter how loud you scream your innocence, no one listens. This isn't fiction. This is the reality that thousands of people have faced because of investigative failures. The system we trust to deliver justice sometimes becomes a machine that crushes the innocent under its weight. Let's start with a name that should make everyone uncomfortable: Steven Avery. In 1985, Avery was convicted of sexual assault and attempted murder in Wisconsin. The victim was absolutely certain he was her attacker. Eyewitness testimony, they said, was rock solid. Avery maintained his innocence, but who listens to a suspect when you have a confident victim pointing directly at them? He spent 18 years behind bars before DNA evidence finally proved what he'd been saying all along. He was innocent. The real perpetrator was someone else entirely, a man whose DNA was in the system, a man who could have been caught if investigators had simply done their job properly. But here's where it gets darker. The investigators had tunnel vision. They focused so intensely on Avery that they ignored other suspects, dismissed alibis, and failed to properly test evidence. When you decide someone is guilty before the investigation is complete, you're not seeking truth anymore. You're building a case. And that's exactly what happened to Steven Avery. The tragedy is that Avery's story didn't end there. Years after his exoneration, he was arrested again, this time for murder. The Netflix documentary, Making a Murderer, raised serious questions about whether the second investigation was also compromised, whether the same department that wrongfully convicted him once might have planted evidence to frame him again. Whether Avery is guilty or innocent of the murder charge, one thing is undeniable: the first investigation was catastrophically flawed, and it destroyed any trust between this man and the justice system. That's what happens when investigations go wrong. They don't just fail once. They create a ripple effect that taints everything that comes after. Now, tunnel vision isn't just a problem in one case or one department. It's a systemic issue that has destroyed countless lives. When investigators lock onto a suspect early, cognitive bias takes over. Confirmation bias makes them see evidence that supports their theory while dismissing anything that contradicts it. They're not bad people, necessarily. They're human beings operating under pressure, wanting to solve cases, wanting to bring closure to victims' families. But good intentions don't excuse bad outcomes. When the desire to close a case overrides the commitment to find the truth, innocent people pay the price. Take the case of the Central Park Five, later known as the Exonerated Five. In 1989, 5 Black and Latino teenagers were arrested for the brutal assault and rape of a jogger in Central Park. The investigation was a perfect storm of everything that can go wrong. Coerced confessions from minors without parents or lawyers present. Aggressive interrogation tactics that lasted for hours. A media circus that convicted them in the court of public opinion before any trial began. And a city so desperate for justice that it accepted a narrative that didn't match the evidence. There was no physical evidence connecting these boys to the crime. None. The confessions contradicted each other and contradicted the facts of the case. But investigators and prosecutors pushed forward anyway because they believed they had their perpetrators. 13 years later, the actual rapist confessed. His DNA matched the evidence from the scene. The 5 young men, who had served between 6 and 13 years in prison, were finally exonerated. But think about what was stolen from them. Their teenage years. Their education. Their innocence. Their trust in a system that was supposed to protect them. One of them, Corey Wise, was just 16 when he was arrested. He spent years in adult prison because he wanted to support his friend. He was beaten, assaulted, and spent time in solitary confinement for a crime he didn't commit. When investigators get it wrong, they don't just fail to find the real criminal. They create new victims. Then there's the insidious problem of forensic science that isn't actually scientific. For decades, courts accepted expert testimony on bite mark analysis, hair comparison, and arson investigation that was later proven to be junk science. We sent people to death row based on an expert claiming they could match bite marks to a defendant with absolute certainty, when in reality, there was no scientific basis for such certainty at all. We convicted people based on microscopic hair comparison, only to discover later that FBI analysts had overstated matches in thousands of cases, and that many of their conclusions were simply wrong. Cameron Todd Willingham was executed in Texas in 2004 for allegedly setting a fire that killed his 3 young daughters. The investigation relied heavily on arson experts who testified that the fire patterns proved it was arson. But after his execution, scientists reviewed the evidence and concluded that the fire was most likely accidental, and that the arson indicators the original investigators relied on were based on outdated, disproven methods. Willingham may have been innocent. We executed him anyway because investigators trusted flawed forensic science. Once someone is executed, there's no do-over. There's no exoneration that brings them back. The finality of that mistake should haunt everyone involved in the justice system. Sometimes, investigations go wrong not because of incompetence, but because of something far more sinister: corruption. When investigators plant evidence, coerce confessions, or hide exculpatory evidence, they're not making mistakes. They're committing crimes. And yet, it happens more often than we'd like to believe. In Chicago, a police commander named John Burge and his officers tortured over 100 suspects, mostly black men, between 1972 and 1991. They used electric shock. Many of those men were convicted and sent to prison based on those coerced confessions. Some were sentenced to death. The torture continued for nearly 2 decades before Burge was finally held accountable, and even then, he was only convicted of perjury, not for the torture itself. Think about that for a moment. Over 100 people were affected by police officers who were supposed to protect them. The system knew. Other officers knew. Prosecutors knew. And yet it continued because closing cases was more important than protecting civil rights. Because convictions mattered more than truth. That's not an investigation gone wrong through error. That's an investigation gone wrong through deliberate, calculated evil. We also have to talk about the role of prosecutors in investigative failures. Prosecutors work closely with investigators, and they have enormous power. They decide what charges to file, what evidence to present, and what plea deals to offer. In theory, prosecutors are supposed to seek justice, not just convictions. But in practice, conviction rates often become measures of success, and that creates a dangerous incentive structure. When your career advancement depends on your win-loss record, the temptation to cut corners becomes stronger. The temptation to hide evidence that might help the defense becomes stronger. The temptation to overcharge defendants to force them into plea deals becomes stronger. The Duke lacrosse case is a perfect example of prosecutorial misconduct derailing an investigation. In 2006, 3 Duke University lacrosse players were accused of rape. The district attorney, Mike Nifong, pursued the case aggressively despite significant problems with the accuser's story and a lack of physical evidence. He made inflammatory public statements, withheld DNA evidence that would have helped the defense, and violated numerous ethical rules. Eventually, the North Carolina Attorney General took over the case, declared the players innocent, and Nifong was disbarred. But the damage was done. 3 young men were publicly branded. Their lives were turned upside down. The Duke lacrosse team's season was cancelled. And all of it happened because a prosecutor was more interested in winning an election than seeking the truth. What these cases reveal is that investigative failures rarely happen in isolation. They're usually the result of multiple system failures working together. Investigators develop tunnel vision. Forensic scientists overstate the certainty of their findings. Prosecutors hide exculpatory evidence. Defense attorneys lack the resources to effectively challenge the state. Judges fail to scrutinize questionable evidence. And appellate courts defer to trial court findings even when there are serious doubts. Each failure compounds the others until an innocent person is convicted, or a guilty person goes free while an innocent person takes their place. The psychological toll on the wrongfully convicted is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine sitting in a cell, year after year, knowing you're innocent but being powerless to prove it. Imagine missing your children growing up. Imagine missing funerals, weddings, and birthdays. Imagine watching your parents age through prison visiting room glass. Imagine the rage, the helplessness, the despair. Some wrongfully convicted people spend decades fighting for their freedom. Some die in prison, never seeing justice. And even those who are eventually exonerated carry the scars forever. They lose time they can never get back. They lose opportunities that will never return. They lose fundamental trust in a society that failed them so catastrophically. There's also the question of the real perpetrators who remain free while innocent people sit in prison. When investigators arrest the wrong person, the actual criminal is still out there, often committing more crimes. In the Central Park jogger case, the real rapist, Matias Reyes, committed additional attacks while the exonerated 5 were in prison. Those victims might have been spared if investigators had done their job properly the first time. Every wrongful conviction is potentially a double failure, an innocent person punished and a guilty person free to harm others. So what causes these catastrophic failures? Sometimes it's the pressure to solve high-profile cases quickly. When the media is demanding answers, when politicians are calling for action, when communities are scared and angry, investigators feel intense pressure to make an arrest. That pressure can lead to shortcuts, to ignoring contradictory evidence, to building a case around a theory rather than following the evidence wherever it leads. Sometimes it's inadequate training. Not every department has resources for continuous education on new forensic techniques or proper interrogation methods. Sometimes it's systemic bias. Studies have repeatedly shown that racial bias affects every stage of the criminal justice system, from who gets stopped by police to who gets charged, who gets convicted, and what sentences they receive. And sometimes, frankly, it's ego. Investigators and prosecutors don't want to admit they might be wrong. Once they've publicly committed to a theory of the case, backing down feels like failure. Admitting error feels like weakness. So they double down, even when evidence suggests they should reconsider. This is particularly dangerous in cases where there's been significant media coverage, because changing course means facing public criticism and damaged reputations. The personal cost of admitting error becomes so high that some investigators and prosecutors will cling to obviously flawed cases rather than face the consequences of being wrong. The good news, if we can call it that, is that awareness of these issues is growing. Innocence projects around the country work tirelessly to investigate wrongful convictions and secure exonerations. Over 3,000 people have been exonerated since 1989, revealing the scope of the problem. Reforms are slowly being implemented, recording interrogations to prevent coerced confessions, improving forensic science standards, implementing blind lineup procedures to reduce misidentification, establishing conviction integrity units in prosecutors' offices, and providing better compensation for the wrongfully convicted. But reform is slow, and for every person who's exonerated, we have to wonder how many more are still sitting in prison, innocent but unable to prove it. These stories should disturb us. They should shake our faith in a system we want to believe is fair and just. But they should also motivate us to demand better. We should demand that investigators follow the evidence rather than their hunches. We should demand that forensic scientists acknowledge the limitations of their methods. We should demand that prosecutors seek justice rather than convictions. We should demand transparency and accountability at every level. And we should remember that behind every wrongful conviction is a human being whose life has been destroyed by a system that failed them. When investigations go wrong, justice doesn't just fail. It becomes injustice. It becomes the very thing it was designed to prevent. These cases remind us that the pursuit of truth requires humility, rigor, and an unwavering commitment to getting it right, even when getting it right is difficult, even when it means admitting error, even when it means letting go of a theory we desperately wanted to be true. Because at the end of the day, justice isn't about winning cases. It's about finding truth. And when we lose sight of that fundamental principle, everyone loses. The innocent suffer. The guilty escape. And our faith in the system that binds our society together slowly erodes, one failed investigation at a time.